Hello, everyone. Welcome back to today's story. In this episode, everything takes a heartbreaking turn as James collapses from a hidden infection in his injured arm and is rushed to the hospital in critical condition. After days of pushing himself beyond his limits just to reach Diep and their family, his body finally gives out, leaving Diep and little Nee fighting panic as they watch him slip in and out of consciousness. What begins as a quiet morning, filled with hope, quickly spirals into a desperate race against time. Stay until the end, because this chapter reveals not only James's incredible will to survive, but also the fierce love that refuses to let him go. And don't forget to subscribe to help us reach 10,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us. The first light of dawn slipped through the bamboo leaves like quiet blessings, painting the faded wooden walls in soft strokes of gold. The rooster crowed once, long and clear, a sound that usually blended into daily life. Yet today, it felt like an echo from another world. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, the small house wasn't wrapped in fear. No late-night knocks. No anonymous calls filled with threats. No trembling whispers shared behind closed doors. Only sparrows chattering in the bamboo grove and the slow, uneven breathing of the man lying on the low wooden bed. James was curled on his side, one arm draped over his face, as if trying to block out the nightmare he had just escaped. The other arm, the one still wrapped in thick white bandages from elbow to wrist, lay stiffly across his chest. His hair, once glued to his forehead by sweat and dirt, had finally been washed clean. His gray shirt hung outside on a bamboo pole, swaying gently in the morning breeze. Even with the new bandages and dark bruises along his ribs, there was something softer in his expression now. The usual lines of exhaustion were still carved deep into his face, but for the first time, his brows weren't furrowed in pain. The corners of his mouth lifted just enough to show relief. A fragile, almost unconscious smile. In the dim kitchen corner, Diep moved carefully, as though afraid that even one uneven breath might break the fragile peace. She stirred the small pot of rice porridge with shaking hands, steam rising in gentle white curls into the pale morning light. Every soft clink of the wooden ladle sounded like a heartbeat reminding her, he's safe, he's here, he's breathing. Every few seconds she paused, turning toward the bedroom, listening for the slightest sound. Even the rustle of a blanket could make her chest tighten. On the porch, little Nee sat with her legs tucked under her, hugging Don's thick golden neck. "Quiet, Don. Daddy's still hurting," she whispered, pressing her cheek against the warm fur. She had never used that word before, not out loud. Daddy. It tasted unfamiliar, beautiful, and heavy on her tongue. She held it carefully, afraid it might slip away if she spoke too loudly. Outside, Grandma Huyen swept the yard with her old bamboo broom. The rhythm was steady, same as always, but her eyes kept drifting toward the half-open door. In just one night, this house had changed. Yesterday, it had smelled of fear, stale prayers, and uneasy silence. Now, it smelled of hot porridge, warm morning air, and hope. Suddenly, a faint groan drifted from the bedroom. Diep froze. The ladle slipped from her fingers and clattered against the pot. She wiped her hands on her apron and rushed into the room. James was struggling to sit up. The moment he moved his injured arm, Pain twisted across his face. He gripped the wooden bed frame with his good hand, trying to anchor himself as the room spun in and out of focus. "Easy, slowly. You just got home," Diep whispered, sliding an arm behind his back. She lifted him gently, inch by inch, until he was propped up against the headboard. James blinked hard. Morning light flooded his tired eyes. For a moment, he looked confused, as if he wasn't sure where he was, or if this was real. The wooden walls, the tiny table, the rosary hanging on a nail, his battered body wrapped in clean bandages. His breath hitched, and then he saw her. "You're here," he rasped, voice cracking. Diep tried to smile, though her eyes shimmered with tears. "I was about to say the same thing." At the doorway, small footsteps tapped softly against the wooden floor. Nye tiptoed in, clutching a crumpled piece of paper decorated with wobbly crayon drawings. She stopped when she reached the bedside, eyes wide with worry. "Daddy, are you hurting?" Her voice trembled. It was the first time she'd seen him this close, without him disappearing again, like a shadow in the night. James forced a weak smile. "Come here, sweetheart." Nye climbed carefully onto the bed, making sure not to bump his injured arm. She placed the drawing in his lap, a messy page filled with bright colors bleeding into each other. 5 stick figures stood in front of a house. Mommy, Daddy, Nye, the baby they were waiting for, and Don the dog. James's lips parted. His throat tightened painfully. With his good hand, he smoothed the wrinkled paper, fingertips brushing the shaky crayon lines. "It's perfect," he whispered. "Just like you." Nye leaned in and hugged him as gently as she could. Her tears weren't from fear this time. They were from relief. Diep watched them, one hand over her mouth. For a breathless moment, it felt like the world had shrunk to this small room. A recovering man, a trembling little girl, and a drawing full of dreams they were just beginning to reclaim. After a minute, Diep quietly said, "Let me help you sit up more. You should eat something." "I can manage," James murmured, bracing himself. "You've been carrying everything. Let me try." He slid his legs off the bed and placed his feet on the floor. His entire body tensed. Every breath seemed to scrape against something deep and wounded inside him. But he pushed up anyway. For 1 second, he stood. The next second, his vision went white. His good knee buckled, hard. His injured arm flared with sharp pain. Every drop of strength drained out of him like water through a cracked jar. His body lurched sideways. "James!" Diep cried. She grabbed for him, but his weight slipped from her hands. His shoulder hit the edge of the bed frame before he collapsed onto the wooden floor with a sickening thud. The sound echoed through the house. Nee screamed. Don barked wildly. Grandma Huyen rushed in, sandals slapping hard on the cement. Diep dropped to her knees, hands shaking so violently she could barely touch him. "James! Look at me! James!" His eyes were open, but unfocused, pupils drifting as if searching for something he couldn't see. Cold sweat poured down his face. His breaths were shallow, ragged, dangerously fast. "Diep!" Grandma Huyen shouted. "Get a blanket under his head. I'm calling the medic." Nye stood frozen in the doorway, sobbing, her small hands gripping Don's fur like she might drown without something to hold on to. Diep lifted his head and slid a folded blanket beneath it. Tears streamed down her cheeks onto his lifeless fingers. "You're not leaving me," she whispered, voice breaking. "You survived all that. You're not dying in my arms. You hear me? You're not." For a moment, his fingers twitched, barely, but it was enough to shatter her. Outside, the sun climbed higher, golden and indifferent. Inside the little wooden house, time stopped, suspended on a thin, trembling line between hope and disaster. Grandma Huyen's voice echoed across the yard as she ran, shouting for help, her words cracking with panic. The little house, only moments ago filled with soft morning light, now throbbed with urgency. Dawn barked nonstop, circling James's unmoving body as if trying to wake him. Nye knelt beside Diep, tiny fingers clutching her mother's sleeve, eyes red and terrified. Inside, Diep leaned over James, brushing damp strands of hair back from his forehead. His skin was cold, too cold, and the bandaged arm lay limp beside him. She pressed her ear near his chest, listening for the uneven rise and fall of his breath. Each inhale sounded weaker than the last, as though his body was slowly surrendering to the exhaustion it had been fighting for too long. "James, stay with me," Diep whispered, gripping his hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Please, don't close your eyes. Look at me." But his eyelids fluttered, barely responding. A faint tremor ran through his fingers before they fell still again. Outside, the rumble of a motorbike cut through the quiet morning air. The village medic, an older man with graying hair and a worn leather bag, jumped off before the bike even stopped. He rushed into the house, breathless. "What happened?" he asked, dropping to his knees beside James. He tried to stand up. He fell," Diep stammered. "His arm was already injured, and he's been weak for days. He couldn't breathe right after he fell. Please help him." The medic's practiced hands checked James's pulse, touched his forehead, pressed gently at the base of his neck. His brows furrowed deeper with every passing second. He unwrapped part of the bandage on James's arm, revealing swollen skin darkened to a frightening shade of blue. "This arm isn't just injured," the medic muttered. "It's infected and spreading fast." The words hit Diep like a punch. Her breath caught in her chest. What do we do?" she asked, voice cracking. "He needs to be taken to the hospital immediately," the medic said, already reaching into his bag. "Right now. If we wait any longer, his body won't hold up." Nye burst into tears. Grandma Huyen pulled her close, whispering shaky reassurances, though her own eyes glistened with fear. Diep cupped James's face, her voice trembling. "James, the medic is here. You're going to the hospital, okay? You'll get treatment. Just stay awake." James opened his eyes for one brief moment. In them flickered a faint glimmer of recognition, a fragile connection trying to hold. His lips parted, but only a dry whisper escaped. "Diep." Then his head turned slightly, and his eyelids slid shut again. Diep swallowed a sob. "We have to carry him," she said. With the medic's help, they lifted James carefully onto a woven bamboo stretcher. Every small movement sent jolts of pain through him. Even unconscious, his brow twitched with each shift. They carried him out to the yard, where the medic's old motorbike with a side carriage waited. "Lay him here," the medic instructed. "I'll ride. One of you come with me." "I'm coming," Diep said instantly. Grandma Huyen grabbed her arm. Diep, you need to stay calm. I'll take Nai and follow with the neighbor. Go, don't waste a second. Diep nodded, wiping tears away with trembling fingers. She climbed into the side carriage beside James, gripping his hand tightly as the medic revved the engine. Dust swirled behind them as the motorbike shot down the dirt road, weaving between bamboo groves and narrow bends. Villagers stopped mid-step, watching with concern as the wounded man passed by, pale, sweating, barely breathing. Some whispered prayers, others shouted, "Be strong!" But their voices blurred into the wind. The ride felt endless. Every bump sent James's body jolting. Diep held his head steady, whispering over and over, "We're almost there. Hold on." But each time she looked at him, he seemed further away, his skin colder, his breaths shallower. By the time they reached the small district hospital, Diep's arms were numb from holding him steady. Nurses ran out with a gurney, lifting James gently. Severe infection, the medic explained quickly. Possible blood loss, and he collapsed. Loss of consciousness. The nurses rushed him inside without hesitation. A doctor in a crisp white coat appeared, barking orders. IV line, antibiotics, oxygen, now. Diep tried to follow, but a nurse held her back. "Miss, please wait outside. We need space to work." "No, he needs me," Diep protested, voice trembling. But the nurse gently closed the door. Through the small glass window, Diep could only see flashes of movement. Gloved hands attaching tubes, checking monitors, pressing stethoscopes to James's chest. Her own heartbeat pounded louder than the footsteps in the hallway. Minutes crawled by. Each one felt like an hour. Nai and Grandma Huyen arrived with a neighbor not long after, rushing across the hallway. "Where is he?" Nai cried. Diep knelt and hugged her tight. "Inside, sweetheart. They're taking care of him." "Is Daddy going to die?" Nai asked, her voice small and trembling. Diep closed her eyes. "No," she whispered, with all the strength she had left. "No. He's fought so much already. He won't leave us. Not now." But inside, her chest tightened painfully. She had seen the fear in the medic's eyes. She had felt James's body grow colder in her arms. She had heard the urgency in the doctor's voice. She had never been more terrified. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door opened. The doctor stepped out, removing his gloves. All three women stood up at once. "Doctor?" Diep asked, barely able to speak. How is he?" The doctor exhaled slowly. "He's stable for now, but his condition is very serious. The infection in his arm has spread into his bloodstream. He's developing sepsis." Diep's legs nearly gave out. Grandma Huyen steadied her. "We've started strong antibiotics and fluids," the doctor continued. "He also has severe exhaustion and dehydration. It will take time, but he's fighting." "Can we see him?" Diep whispered. The doctor nodded. "One at a time." Diep stepped inside the room with careful, trembling steps. James lay on the bed, connected to tubes and monitors. His chest rose and fell with the help of an oxygen mask. His injured arm was now rebandaged with sterile white wrappings, but the swelling remained, frightening and dark. Diep moved closer, pulling a small chair beside him. She took his good hand gently into hers, her thumb stroking the back of it. "You scared me," she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. "But you're here. You're alive. And you're going to get better. I'm right here, James. I'm not leaving." For the first time since he collapsed, James's eyelids twitched. Then slowly, heavily, they opened, just enough for his eyes to find her. "Diep," he breathed weakly. Diep leaned closer, pressing her forehead against his. "I'm here." His lips curved slightly beneath the oxygen mask, a smile so faint it could have been imagined, but she felt it